In Winnipeg's historic Playhouse Theatre on August 26, 1944, on this stage, one of Europe's most gifted choir directors conducted his final concert. But while the distinguished musical career of Alexander Koshetz came to a sudden end, the legacy of this remarkable man inspired the career of one of Canada's most celebrated choirs. Over 50 years after his death, the Alexander Koshetz Choir, under the direction of Walter Klymkiw, continues to enchant audiences wherever they appear. They have sung for cardinals and presidents, appeared on radio and television, and have won numerous prestigious awards. The Alexander Koshetz Choir. They have performed hundreds of concerts, toured 3 continents, and produced several recordings of Ukrainian folk and liturgical music. Koshetz Choir has over 90 members reinforcing a wide range of vocal octaves. Their ages extend from the late teens to the 80s, but they are united by their genuine love of choral singing, frequently without accompaniment or a cappella. Although choral music is closely linked with religion, many famous choral arrangements sung by the choir adopted thematic material from folklore and peasant scenes. Choral music was one of the most popular art forms brought to North America by the Ukrainian immigrants, but it was essentially Alexander Koshetz who propelled choral singing to high technical levels not heard before. He also virtually single-handedly created an entire school of choral directors. When he died, a void was left. He had left an indelible imprint on the minds and spirits of numerous Canadians and Americans of Ukrainian descent. But who was the man who had created such an impact on choral music, and in the 1920s was proclaimed a musical genius by critics in America and Europe? Alexander Antonovich Koshetz was born in 1875 near Kyiv, Ukraine, then part of the Russian Empire. The 8th and youngest child of Father Anton and Yevdokia Koshetz, Alexander spent his childhood in the village of Tarasilka. He was educated in religious schools, and in 1901 he graduated from the famous Kyiv Theological Academy. Soon after, he married Barbara Popova, but their marriage proved quickly to be an unhappy one, and although they had one son, in 1905 they divorced.
He thought that she was the most beautiful woman in Ukraine, and he loved her so deeply. They were married, but the marriage didn't last because she proved to be unfaithful. And this is one thing that he could not stand, is any person, a friend, be it whoever, unfaithfulness. And they had many arguments over this and so on. And even when the son came, that didn't help much. She still went on cavorting, dancing. She loved a good time, and he couldn't take it. So they were divorced. But he loved her. He loved her to the end of his life. He loved her.
Koshetz pursued his musical career with renewed vigor. In fact, by the time he was separated from Popova, he was traveling throughout Ukraine searching for and documenting Ukrainian folk songs from the regions of Kyiv and Kuban. It was at this time that choral arrangements of Ukrainian folk songs were beginning to gain the attention of musicologists. He then studied the art of composing music with Hryhorij Lyubomirsky, co-founder of the Lysenko Music and Drama School in Kyiv. Mykola Lysenko had made an enormous contribution to the development of secular choral music in Ukraine and was a tremendous cultural influence on many Ukrainian composers, including Koshetz. By 1916, Koshetz had taught at the Kiev Conservatory, organized student choirs, and served as director of Sadovsky's Theater, the first resident theater in Ukraine. Now at the age of 41, he was conductor and choir master of the Kiev Opera. The following year was perhaps the most instrumental in establishing the direction of Koshetz's life. In 1917, he married 25-year-old Tatiana Hehoryevska, whom he had met earlier while directing the St. Volodymyr University Students' Choir. The same year, the revolution erupted, throwing Ukraine and Russia into political upheaval. As Tsarist prohibitions against Ukraine stopped, national rights and independence were achieved. Several composers like Koshetz, Mykola Leontovich, and Kyrylo Stetsenko took the lead in organizing the musical activity of society. They organized state choirs and choral ensembles. Historical books on Ukrainian music were published. With the revival of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Ukraine was enjoying a renaissance of church music based entirely on popular motifs arranged by the new composers. Vocal music reigned supreme. However, as the Soviet regime seized power from the Ukrainian National Republic, they began to systematically suppress all forms of Ukrainian cultural and national life. Established institutes were reorganized in accordance with the dictates of the Communist Party. In 1919, Koshetz, backed by the Ukrainian government, organized the Ukrainian Republican Kapelle. Politically motivated, it was to embark on a tour of Western Europe to acquire support for Ukrainian independence by impressing Europe with Ukrainian choral music. As the choir prepared for the tour, some of its members quit, unable to make the agonizing decision. Once out of Ukraine, they would likely never return. The Soviet government intensified its policy against the arts in Ukraine, and several of Koshetz's colleagues, like Leontovich, met questionable deaths. Meanwhile, Koshetz and the renamed Ukrainian National Choir were touring Western Europe, receiving critical acclaim everywhere they appeared. In 1922, concert promoter Max Rabinoff brought Koshetz and the National Choir to New York. Here they appeared at Carnegie Hall and produced their first recording. After a hugely successful tour of South America, Koshetz brought the legendary National Choir to Winnipeg, where they appeared at the Industrial Building on December 12, 1923. Also known as the Board of Trade Building, this was the city's largest auditorium.
If I shut my eyes, I can see him. I can see all these beautifully dressed women and men marching up on the platform. It was an arena. It was not a concert hall. It was an arena, and the stage was placed in the center. And they came marching up all in their beautiful costumes. And it was just a mass of color. And then everybody stood at attention, and then comes Koshetz, this dapper gentleman, you know, waving his hands and walking up straight with his white tie and his tails, and coming up on the stage, and then this terrific, thunderous applause. And of course he bowed and so on. And then they sang. I didn't know much about singing a choir, but it was beautiful. It was beautiful music. I'll never forget it.
After their second recording, the National Choir disbanded. Koshetz was hired as director of the Stony Point Vocal Ensemble of the American Institute of Operatic Art. A few years later, perhaps finding life dull, he formed a new choir and began touring again. They returned to Winnipeg for a concert in 1926. Koshetz was a hot commodity. He enjoyed the adoration. He associated with the aristocracy of society, and he loved the finer things in life. With earnings of $300 a week, a huge sum in those days, Koshetz and wife Tatiana traveled extensively.
I think Rabinoff was an admirer of Koshetz, in spite of the fact that the two of them didn't get along all that well, but he admired Koshetz, and he realized that without Koshetz, the choir would be nothing. Because there was talk that, well, we're the ones that do the singing, and he's sort of almost superfluous. I mean, we're the ones that really, people come to hear us. And it's true he stands up and directs, but it's not necessarily him that they come to see, it's us. And Rabinoff didn't believe in that at all. He realized that Koshetz, if it wasn't for Koshetz, those people, there would be no choir. And so that's why he paid him a handsome salary.
People were throwing money on the stage, flowers. It was just great. I think he handled it very elegantly and very intelligently. He wasn't the type of person that success went to his head.
So you have a combination of a person who was a very, very fine mind, a great musician, very well read, and this tremendous personality. And when you put all these things together, you have a remarkable human being. And all his life was devoted to music.
But despite his success, he often thought about Ukraine and longed to be there. He wrote incessantly to his homeland and eventually received offers to direct a major choral group in Soviet Ukraine. Koshetz would have loved nothing more and immediately went to France to begin the necessary preparations. But he lacked faith in communist rule. Besides, he knew full well that the Soviet government was already transforming the remaining fragments of free musical expression into a tool for political propaganda. He declined any offers and returned to the U.S., where he and his wife became American citizens. He actively carried on scholarly research on Ukrainian music and published articles. He made live radio appearances, produced more recordings, and he toured the U.S. with an American choir and Vasily Avraменko's dance troupe. In 1938, he arranged the musical score for a feature film. Koshetz had enjoyed a long, illustrious career. He had composed Ukrainian church music, arranged numerous Ukrainian national songs and carols, arranged songs from other nations, and published music for children and adults.
Ukrainian songs were translated into English. And then later on, after he had left Whitmark, he did a number of songs, a series of songs similarly for Silver Burdett, which was another publishing firm that published, and this music was specifically children's songs. The other one was, with Whitmark, was Ukrainian folk music, just folk songs. This one was specifically children's songs. He did about 25 of them. And then finally, Whitmark asked him to rearrange, produce new arrangements of some American standards, such as Cole Porter's Night and Day, and there were a number of other well-known popular American sort of popular songs, and they asked Koshetz to do new arrangements for that, and he did that. I think it was for Harms, which was a publisher also of American music.
64 years old. Years of stressful living were taking their toll on him, and he increasingly suffered periods of illness. Although his reputation was soaring, he believed his career was waning. He increasingly felt exiled in the U.S. and viewed Canada only with indifference. Large-scale touring was out of the question because he no longer had a good concert promoter. His only ongoing project was conducting a choir made up of several hundred voices for special events. In 1939, Koshetz appeared in concert at the New York State World's Fair.
He said that he was almost a rich man. And then he said this person came along and convinced him to buy land, to buy this, to buy that, and invest his money. Koshetz trusted him and believed in him. In the meantime, he took the money, and that was the last of him. That upset him terribly. And he was in the hospital. He was a sick man for a long time. As a matter of fact, he never came back to his normal health.
Then there were investments in other areas like oil and whatever that didn't pay off, you know. So these were not blue chip investments, they were speculative investments, and the result was that Koshetz pretty well lost his life savings. He was, while he was working for Rabinov, well, you know, the money came in. After he stopped working for Rabinov, he didn't have like regular, shall we say, regular employment. He would have just occasionally, people would ask him for, let's do this project, let's do that project, choral projects usually. Before he was able to go to Europe on a whim and go from spa to spa, probably not worrying about finances at all. After this, I think he would have had to watch his pennies.
He was almost like on Mount Olympus at the tail end of his days in Ukraine, and then traveling around Europe and the Western Hemisphere, lauded by the world as a musical genius. And then he plummeted down to earth and barely made a living.
At this time in Winnipeg, Paul Matsanko, a choral director, musicologist, and pedagogue, was attempting to initiate higher educational courses for Ukrainian Canadian cultural activists. Unable to obtain enough local support for his idea, the first summer course was held in Toronto. Based on its success, Matsanko finally received backing for his summer courses from the Ukrainian National Federation in Winnipeg. It was the summer of 1941, and in Eastern Europe, Germany was crushing the last remnants of Ukrainian culture. The UNF was a national body established in Edmonton by members of the Ukrainian War Veterans Association of Canada, who needed a means of expanding support for the Ukrainian national cause in Europe. Matsanko had grown up in Ukraine and was well aware of Koshetz's musical authority in the world. He was extremely anxious to have him come to Winnipeg, having seen him the summer before in Toronto.
The first year, it was a bit of a struggle, yes, but and it proved to be successful. And the first year in Winnipeg, that's when there was more sort of bickering, so to speak. We can't afford it. We have to import his wife. It costs a lot of money. We have to pay his board and room. You know, the usual. After a while, he kind of, my husband had a way of his own particular way of getting you over to his side. So they agreed, well, we'll try it. We'll try it and we'll see how it works out.
To his delight, Alexander and Tatiana arrived in Winnipeg for the 1941 summer course. Koshetz was not aware of the dynamic Ukrainian population here and was impressed with the attention given him. He gave lectures on Ukrainian musical history and taught choral singing throughout July and August. At the end of the course, he directed the mixed choir at a concert in Winnipeg's Walker Theatre. Between 1941 and 1944, Koshetz lived in New York but returned to Winnipeg each summer to teach Ukrainian choral music. Although his students were enthusiastic, Koshetz never considered himself a teacher. However, according to those who knew Koshetz, he had a magnetic personality and possessed a remarkable ability to teach.
We learned a lot from him, like our diction with the words had to be just so. And he stressed for perfection. And we tried our best. It was in the evening, a lot of other people came to sing with the choir. And a lot of them were good musicians, so we had to learn fast because in 2 months we had to be ready for a concert.
I started Koshetz in 1943, and Alexander Koshetz was conducting at that time. And it was my memory of him is the amazing way he conducted. He used his hands, of course, but quite often he would just stand in front of us and his eyebrows would move, his eyes would move, and he conducted with his eyes and his eyebrows. He didn't even have to use his hands. Sort of like, his eyes would go up and down in time to the music, and his smile and that, especially when it was a kolameka or something. It was just wonderful to watch him, and you really had to watch and concentrate.
And later on, I really understood what people talked about when they talked about his magnetic personality. He charmed young people into loving Ukrainian music with his tremendous magnetism on stage. When he stood in front of us with his roly-poly face and balding head and lovely eyes and mustache, and he smiled, it just made you feel like $1 million. This remarkable personality.
Koshetz chose to stay with friends while living in Winnipeg. He frequently attended St. Mary the Protectress Ukrainian Orthodox Cathedral and was made an honorary member of the Ukrainian National Home. He became godfather to Paul and Stephanie Matsenko's son, also named Alexander. But soon after the Ukrainian Summer Course concert in 1944, Koshetz became ill and died. He received a grand funeral, and thousands of people lined the streets of Winnipeg to pay their final respects. He was laid to rest nearby in the Glen Eden Cemetery. Tatiana returned to the U.S. Shortly after, she returned to Winnipeg and, along with Paul Matsenko and others, co-founded the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center. For a short time, Tatiana and Paul Matsenko lectured at the summer courses and taught choral music. But in 1951, Walter Klymkiw, fresh out of university, took over the leadership of the mixed choir of the Ukrainian National Youth Organization. Born in Ukraine in 1928, Klymkiw came from a long family tradition of singing, and he loved music.
I started from the seat of my pants, from the few lessons that we had in Koshetz on how to conduct by Dr. Matsenko, which wasn't very much. But of course I loved it, and I love music, and I could play the violin very well. I mean, I had good musical training, but not chorally. And of course, I knew very little about conducting. So Mrs. Koshetz was already the curator of the museum. And she, in fact, taught me an awful lot. We'd talk long hours about music, about Koshetz, about other people. She would select music for me, suggest what she thought was in good taste and what was in poor taste, and what was good music and what was bad music. It's a very subjective kind of thing. She would sing Koshetz's, from Koshetz's repertoire, how Koshetz would sing a certain song. And almost by osmosis, even if you're the stupidest person in the world, you would learn something. I mean, to me it was a conservatory, private lessons in Ukrainian folk music.
Over the years, Klymkiw divided his time between directing the choir and teaching junior high school. They honed their skills by singing at weddings, funerals, and anniversary concerts.
But in those early days, the dancers or the choir members were also the dancers. Whatever costumes you had, you danced in the costume, you sang in the costume in concerts, and it was belonging to Ukrainian National Youth Federation was a social way of life for us. In those days, there was no TV, nobody had cars. It was everybody, you either walked or rode a bicycle or took the streetcars. And we had oodles of kids coming to Muna. On Sunday night meetings, we'd have 300 young people come to a meeting. And there was hundreds and hundreds of them came through Muna and through the choir. We had some great times. We used to go on concerts, cavalcades, we called them in Manitoba.
They performed in various small towns and cities in Canada and the U.S. Finally, in 1967, under the name O Koshetz Memorial Choir, they appeared as ambassadors of Ukrainian choral music at Expo 67, Canada's premier universal exhibition. The centennial celebration held in Montreal is still regarded as the greatest World's Fair.
We were not main stage shows. They would have literally dozens and dozens and dozens of groupings coming in, and they would give them little slots. Sometimes they were outdoor stages, and we have even pictures. And people would gather around and sing. They'd stay for a while and go. It was that kind of atmosphere. It wasn't a main stage show. It was just suggested that we are no longer a youth choir. We could either call ourselves UNF mixed choir, or why not? Because after all, we're so strongly tied in with Koshetz. He initiated our interest in choral music, and B, his widow was our mentor, as well as his disciple, Dr. Matsanko. And so there's nothing more natural than to call it the Alexander Koshetz Choir.
Koshetz Choir was growing in musical stature and performing in larger venues. Klymkiw's reputation for being able to draw artistry out of people resulted in a more sophisticated sound.
He worked with Tatiana Koshetz, he worked with Dr. Matsanko, he studied on his own and so forth. And ultimately, when these people went on, he took over and did a credible job, very, very good job. It was a pleasure to be in a choir that he conducted and was responsible for, and so on. And of course, today, the product that he puts on stage speaks for itself. It's just, it's fantastic.
The choir, which had often performed with Winnipeg's Rusalka dancers, was now singing with the Winnipeg Symphony Orchestra.
The relationship between us and the orchestra started from a very minimal relationship where we sang a few a cappella numbers at a Pops concert, to where we are now part of their programming schedule.
I thought the very first time I ever heard the Koshetz Choir that they had this very distinctive sound. I'd like to call it a Ukrainian sound, but I don't know enough about Ukrainian choirs to know if it's typical, but it seems to me to be a sound that comes out of the language and out of the culture. The women, for example, sound like women. They don't sound like girls. The fashion in so many choirs these days, especially when singing Bach, is to have the women as light as possible, but in the Koshetz Choir they're big sounding. And the men too are very profound. I remember hearing the choir at the Winter Cities concert earlier this year under the direction of Walter Klymkiw, and the men have this terrific timbre, this kind of, it's not a buzz or a rattle, but it is a kind of vibrancy in the sound. So the sound lives, and it's always sung with such conviction. It's a quite unique sound within Winnipeg. Consequently, they've made a very unique contribution. And to hear them singing actually in Ukrainian, I find that to be just a most amazing thing, because the language lends itself to this kind of sound. Association with Koshetz has undoubtedly come about through the indefatigable Walter Klymkiw, whose leadership, whose authority, musical authority and personal authority over the choir seems to be born of a tremendous tradition and also tremendous experience and tremendous love of the choir too. And Walter's sense of wanting to perform with the symphony, Walter's sense of what works would work for a Koshetz is a very important part of that relationship. I know when he recommended Yevhen Stankovic, who came as the very first visiting composer to the very first Du Maurier Limited New Music Festival way back now in 1992, Stankovic was somebody who was only a name to most of us, but Walter really felt that this was a composer that we should consider. And sure enough, the Koshetz Choir acquitted themselves marvelously on that occasion with a contemporary Ukrainian work. So we, as a symphony orchestra, we're used to performing contemporary works, we're used to performing symphonic works, and the Koshetz Choir fit into that category, but they also fit into the category of folk performance, of course. And it's this ability to cross the boundaries between what is regarded as folk and what's regarded as classical and contemporary that ultimately the Koshetz have got it right, because there's no distinction, there's only good and bad music. And of course they're quite right to make no distinction between folk, classical and contemporary. So I would put the relationship really down to the spirit and energy of that one extraordinary individual, Walter Klymkiw.
In 1976, Anatoly Avdiivsky, conductor of Kyiv's famous Veryovka folk ensemble, was invited by government officials to perform a Canadian choral workshop in Winnipeg. Controversy immediately erupted in the Ukrainian community. Protesters wanted the cultural arrangements stopped, demanding that the Soviet Union allow Canadian artists to perform in Ukraine without restrictions. Nevertheless, Avdiivsky came to Winnipeg, and with his help, 2 years later, Koshetz Choir traveled to Ukraine by invitation of the Soviet Ukraina Society. Klymkiw was elated at returning to his country of birth. Buoyed by the thrill of performing on Ukrainian soil, where much of their repertoire had originated, the choir members endured the Cold War suspicions which pursued them.
I remember the elite there, the KGB's, all their security and what have you, going through the repertoire of music that we had brought with us. And 50% of it was being X'd out. Yet, mostly religious, mostly the works that were written by Alexander Koshetz. You were kind of uptight about the whole thing because, again, I repeat, I was there in 71 and back again in 76, and you're constantly looking over your shoulder sort of thing, and watching your P's and Q's.
That a lot of our how shall I say, our patriotic songs were not allowed over there. When we go to sing there, they're so amazed that we know these songs. Where did we get them from? Where did the music come? They didn't have access to any of these things.
Back in Canada, some Ukrainian nationalists accused the choir of being communist sympathizers. Furthermore, unable to secure any arts grants, choir members had to pay half the cost of the tour out of pocket. But Klymkiw still believes they had made the correct move.
And I know a lot of people who were against us going here in Canada were against us going and gave us a hard time. They would get letters from their relatives saying, what a remarkable thing this trip was. And boy, did they ever change their minds when their own relatives and brothers and so forth told them, don't be an idiot. This is the best thing we ever had. It was a breath of fresh air for us. So it was, to me, a historic event. There's no question about it. Among the many historic events that the choir was involved in.
Undeterred by political wrangling, Koshetz Choir continued singing and developing its unique musical style. Klymkiw was maturing as choir conductor even though his day job of elementary and junior high school principal placed heavy demands on his schedule. Through his continued friendship with Anatoly Avdiivsky in Kiev, the choir was eager to return to Ukraine.
If there is a 1996 equivalent of Koshetz, it would be Avdiivsky, except that Avdiivsky did not have the training in religious music that Koshetz had, but he has so many of the elements.
In 1982, a Jubilee concert was held in Winnipeg in honor of His Beatitude Yosef Cardinal Schlippe, head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church. The Alexander Koshetz Choir performed for his 90th birthday. But later that year, Klymkiw led the choir back to Ukraine. Ukraine's journalists and critics were impressed by a choir that would pay its own way to find its national roots. Although the choir was permitted some liberties, their song roster was still subjected to Soviet scrutiny.
The key here was a piece of sacred music from the 17th century by Delatsky. Although it was sung not in Ukrainian but in Church Slavonic, nonetheless this was an Easter piece, and it was simply unacceptable to the officials. Klymkiw, with his stubbornness and his diplomatic finesse, ultimately prevailed. And although he did make a minor concession by eliminating one or two passages, nonetheless, this long and extremely beautiful piece of music was sung publicly, probably for the first time since the 1920s.
Koshetz Choir performed to capacity audiences in Lviv, Kiev, Chernivtsi, and Ternopil. But the most significant factor of this tour was the awareness they were spreading. For Ukrainians in Ukraine, it was convincing proof that their musical culture, which had so long been suppressed, had not only been preserved in North America, but was also dynamically flourishing and embracing young people.
The people who saw us, and especially the people who were real Ukrainians and who were sort of pushed down, they felt so good on the inside because they didn't feel alone anymore. Because here were these people from beyond the Iron Curtain who came here and sang songs that they didn't hear that often. Something very fresh. Because their concerts were full of Slava party and music that was approved. So that second concert was very, very emotionally charged and interesting as well, but it was also had some heavy weight in terms of the Brezhnev days, which were awful days for Ukrainian culture.
The idea to tour South America originated at a concert performance in Toronto's Massey Hall. It was believed that the concerts and the cooperation necessary to facilitate such a tour would go far in uniting the Ukrainian communities in this region of the world. An invitation to visit the Ukrainian diaspora resulted in a 3-week tour of Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay in 1985.
We haven't even started the concert yet, just the national hymns. And after every number, the audience just went crazy. This was a non-Ukrainian audience. The choir sang so beautifully. I mean, they were so charged up. It was a beautiful concert. That was one of the great experiences, Posadas. I'll never forget it.
They sang in Spanish. They had a children's choir, and they had a grown-up choir. But at the end, we all got together and we sang the Ode to Joy in German. That was a memorable occasion.
Soon after returning from the South American tour, plans began to commemorate 1,000 years of Christianity in Ukraine. In 1987, Koshetz Choir launched its Millennium Tour of Western Europe, including France, Belgium, and Germany. The following year, once again inspired by Klymkiw's vision, the choir participated in a celebration of note, an ambitious Millennium concert held in Winnipeg. The concert series featured premiere performances of newly commissioned works by some of the foremost Ukrainian composers of Ukraine and Paris. When Koshetz Choir again toured Ukraine in 1990 and 1993, they witnessed firsthand the amazing cultural revival taking place. Gone were the KGB-controlled performances, nervous tour guides, and censored song lists. Klymkiw even held impromptu rehearsals with the choir in parking lots. Audiences now displayed tear-filled emotion, and endless ovations were demanded as the choir sang the songs of their ancestors. Divine liturgies were once again sung in the massive Eastern European cathedrals. Like the voices of angels, the choral voices ascended into the huge domes before cascading downward onto the people seated below. These majestic structures adorned with icons were architecturally designed with singing in mind.
The feeling that comes over you as you sing the liturgy in a place like that is just, it's undescribable.
In 1992, Klymkiw traveled to Ukraine on behalf of the choir to receive the Taras Shevchenko State Prize for their contribution in popularizing Ukrainian music and maintaining cultural traditions. No arts group from the outside had ever received such an honor from the government of Ukraine, and it was viewed as a phenomenal accomplishment. Avdiivsky, who had influenced the choir so extensively, praised Koshetz Choir as the best choral group living in the Ukrainian diaspora.
I know when I got the telegram, and I opened it up in the garage, and I opened it and I read it, and I started to cry. It was such an emotional thing. I never expected such a thing. He said, we want to thank you for maintaining the culture that we couldn't maintain here in that far distant land. And we also want to thank you for coming here and bringing, even for a short period of time, alive the Ukrainian culture that we couldn't produce here. Those words were so important, and so important to me personally.
During its history, numerous financial donors plus thousands of volunteer hours and sheer dedication have gone into making Koshetz Choir a continued reality. Juggling families and day jobs with singing has been commonplace and not without difficulty. Most of their costumes are handmade. Because membership with the choir is on a volunteer basis only, grants and donations are necessary to offset expenditures, such as touring and recording.
We have a nucleus that has been with us for many, many years, and they have learned how to approach a recording. And consequently, because of that approach and because of those people's the people that have stayed with us and have recorded with us over the many years that we've done some recordings, we are now and have now reached a fair level of recording ability.
Choir members and associates all take turns at funding initiatives such as annual dinners and bingo. Although the choir itself requires funding, it has a long tradition of helping other performers and organizations. For instance, each Christmas the choir sings Ukrainian carols, which deeply touch the emotions of its people. All the funds raised go to Oseradok, the Ukrainian Cultural and Educational Center.
In the beginning, when the building itself was being refurbished and right from ground up, the members of the Koshetz Choir were very, very helpful in that, because they came here, rolled up their sleeves, and started right from the concrete work that had to do, where they had lathe or whatever was involved. Without that assistance from the Koshetz Choir members, we would not have Oserak at the point where it is today.
The choir has also played host to many visiting Ukrainian entertainers and arts groups. Koshetz Choir has its own business structure and constitution, and expects its members to adhere to its guidelines.
Anytime you lead a large group, it's a lot of work, it's a lot of time, a lot of effort. You're always coordinating activities, trying to keep things on track. It's quite challenging when you get different personalities and different opinions, and you act as mediator for the group as well.
The choir executive also awards scholarships to eligible members who are formerly studying music. People have come and gone from the choir, but long-standing members insist they are a family. And like a typical family, there have been moments of joy, sadness, and tragedy. Klymkiw has also experienced special moments when the air feels charged with electricity, when musically and emotionally the choir transcends into oneness tantamount to spiritual ecstasy. However, for many, being part of the choir has its own significance.
These 24 years have been enriching, have been rewarding, and have been inspiring years. And through all the events of my life for the past 24 years, I've experienced some personal sad moments and many very happy and memorable moments. And being a part of this choir has been the constant, or the common thread that has connected the various passages in my life.
Because of choir, because of what it's taught me, I've learned that, yeah, you know, these are all great people. We may not all see eye to eye on everything, but we all have the best interests of the choir at heart, and we're just taking different roads to get there. A great group of people.
There is nothing like the human voice to express yourself and to give you pleasure and give others pleasure at the same time.
And a lot of people think that my parents forced me to join the choir, but I watched the choir perform many times, and I just thought, as soon as I get old enough, I'm going to join, and I did. And since I've joined, I've been really happy about it, and I've really, really enjoyed it so much.
Choir, 1 and 2 and 1 and 2.
Observing Klymkiw is like watching an artist painting without a brush. The voices become his palette, which yields the colors while the accompanist provides the necessary texture. Not all the choir members are Ukrainian or completely understand the language. Klymkiw meticulously explains the meaning and details behind each song, so that the choir, like a mirror, reflects the feeling of the song with their voices. With the wave of a hand, their voices become instruments of unparalleled beauty, tempo, fullness of sound, pureness of harmony, tone, dynamics, beginnings and endings are controlled.
When you sing your music, when you talk about things that you have in common, rather than about the things that you don't have in common, you're going to succeed. And people are going to appreciate what you do. And music is, to me, it's one of the great things. Of all the arts, I think it's closest to God.
Klymkiw is largely credited for the placing of Ukrainian choral music into the mainstream of Canadian life. In 1993, St. Andrew's College in Winnipeg presented him with an honorary doctorate of canon law as a tribute and recognition of his work in choral, liturgical, and folk music. His quest to emulate Alexander Koshetz and to an extent Anatoly Avdiivsky has led Koshetz Choir on a long and winding journey that often paralleled the path of Koshetz himself. They have acted in the capacity of world-class entertainers, ambassadors, Ukrainian patriots, and philanthropists. Alexander Koshetz achieved all that the early Ukrainian composers were striving for: national recognition, a high degree of professionalism, and finally, the opportunity to capture the international concert stage. Little did he realize that through the efforts of Paul Matsanko, his few short summers in Winnipeg would inspire a group of people who not only would proudly carry forward his legacy, but would embody the entire spirit of one of the most profound periods in Ukrainian musical history. Koshetz once mentioned that in the eventuality of his death, he would like his remains returned to his beloved Ukraine. Although this never occurred, Klymkiw and the Alexander Koshetz Choir have surely borne his soul to the homeland and completed the final chapter of his life.